All right, so let's make a start. So welcome everyone, my name's Mary Lee. I'm the founder of West Berks Climate Action Network, and we're the ones who have organised this talk, but we have pushed it out as far as and as wide as we could get. So I'm sure there's people from all over the country here today, so that's very exciting. We set this talk up because we saw, various pieces of news about the CEE Bill, and we wanted to understand more about it. We're in the fortunate position of having Sir Brian Hoskins as a relatively local person to us, and so we had the fortunate position of being able to invite him along. But we also have Nessie Haynes Matos, who is the one of the people who first set up the CEE Bill, and now she is the director of the CEE Bill Alliance for the research part, and for the CEE Bill development and curation. And we also have Ketan Jha, who is a lecturer in law at the University of Brighton and part of Plan B's legal team. So he's got the experience from the perspective of putting legislation into action in order to ensure that the UK sticks to its climate targets. So just a bit of housekeeping first. We will be recording this video and uploading it to YouTube afterwards. So the video link will be available in the Facebook event afterwards. We are trying to live stream to Facebook, but I'm not entirely sure that that's working at the moment. That may become working as the event goes on. But we would ask you to turn your cameras off when we get going, so that we can just focus on the three key speakers that we have here tonight. And what else to say? The format is that we will have 10 minutes from Nessie to start with to introduce herself, but also to introduce what the CEE Bill is all about, as she's one of the first people who set up the bill. Then we'll go to Brian Hoskins to introduce himself. Now, I'll just give a brief overview because I didn't before, and I introduced Nessie and Ketan. Brian is the founding member and director of the Grantham Institute for Climate Change and the Environment. He sat on the Committee for Climate Change, and he also contributed to the 2007 I forget what IPCC stands for, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Right. So lots of really interesting speakers, lots of good credentials from Brian, but also from Nessie and from Ketan. So Brian will give a little bit of introduction about his involvement previously in the Climate Change Act and the history of the Climate Change Act and how that has developed over the years since it was introduced in 2008. And then we'll go over to 10 minutes from Ketan to talk about how the legislation works in practice. Then we'll go back to Nessie for 10 minutes, and then we'll open the floor to questions. Now, we have received questions before the event, so we will try to make sure that those are addressed as well. We have amalgamated some of the questions, so if you don't hear your question specifically, it's probably because we've combined it into a group of questions. So if you feel that we haven't answered your question thoroughly, then please do say so on the chat and we'll return to address that. And please do ask questions on the chat after the first 40 minutes when we go into the Q&A session. And I will be asking those questions to Brian, Nessie and Ketan so that we have a flow of the questions. Okay, so having said all that, we will go into the talk itself. So I hand over to Nessie to introduce herself and the CEE Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks ever so much for having me. just a really quick introduction. A few of us began from Extinction Rebellion. I was part of Extinction Rebellion Citizens Assembly Working Group, and also on Global XR, working in deliberative democracy. And we had about a year ago, had tried to place the XR's 3 demands into a bill legalese, if you like. And then the election happened. We decided that if we had a more nuanced approach by bringing in experts, scientists, climate scientists, ecologists, along with lawyers, then we would be able to build something that could be reflective of the 3 demands, but actually aligned, really truly aligned to the current science, and also be something that could be viable across a broad church of people beyond XR. So that's how we began, and we began it in January, all of us as volunteers. And we've got to this point now when it was the bill's title was tabled on the 2nd of September by Caroline Lucas MP, and we now have 75 MPs who have publicly backed the bill, and an early day motion. So I will just begin by sharing my screen. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see the slides. So I have very little time, so I will rush through these quite quickly, but the keywords are all in red. I thought if I just highlighted keywords, it may help a little bit and keep me on track as well. So let's see, I will go through the slides in this order. So I'll set the scene, and then a little bit on the background of how our bill was premised on the Paris Agreement, and then a little bit about the details of the bill, the principles of the bill, and then the argument for why we need this kind of emergency legislation as a dual climate and ecological act. So I will move on. So just quickly, there's a quote from the UN Secretary General, really about the nature of the climate crisis, the emergency, and you can see in red, it's very much around human harm, and also of course to our planetary harm as well. Then I'll move on to the ecological crisis, and again you can see, that the ecological crisis dovetails with the climate crisis quite clearly. It also touches on our food and energy, our biodiversity, quality of air, water, and zoonotic disease, and so forth, so human health. And then let's start here with the Paris Agreement 2015. So we were inspired, our bill was inspired by a paper by Professor Tim Jackson. It was titled Zero Carbon Sooner. It was a CUSP paper, and it was premised on the most ambitious target of the Paris Agreement, which was 1.5, holding global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But with the UK contributing a fair share to keeping these temperatures consistent to to holding that level. And from that, he extrapolated what our carbon budget should be by taking into consideration our historical carbon debt as well. And as well looking at per capita, the wealth of our country, and also, so it was, we built it on this, we looked at this paper, and then from there, we started to work with ecologists who also wanted to emphasize the flip side of the crisis, of the ecological crisis that dovetails with the climate crisis. So just a little bit about, after 2015, the report in 2018 by the IPCC really was an amalgamation of the most current scientific evidence on why 1.5 degrees centigrade as a global temperature was much safer and vital to hold over 2 degrees centigrade. And there were lots of arguments about the difference, these incremental differences. I mean, with each, between 1.5 and 2, there are massive differences to life on Earth in terms of climate and ecology and human civilization, with greater impacts, of course, on the majority world countries than the minority world countries. What was interesting, though, with the Paris Agreement is that the only legally binding part of it is that countries, signatories or parties to the convention, have signed a legally binding agreement to report their progress. So otherwise, it's a set of pledges. Now, when it looked, we were looking at there are lots of articles within the Paris Agreement, which are like principles, which these signatories have signed up to. So a lot of it is about equity, global equity, or fairness. There was one part that was interesting about financial flows, and it was really interesting. I found some research that showed that the UK was in the top 7 emitters of cumulative emissions. When you think of the UK, where it was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, heavily dependent on coal. So if you put it in that context, our historical carbon debt is enormous. So I'm going to move on to the next slide. So therefore, one could argue the UK is more responsible than so many countries for global warming. One of the articles in the Paris Agreement is about principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which actually means some countries are in a much better position to mitigate their emissions than others in terms of wealth and infrastructure. So they do, in the Paris Agreement, though, there's relatively little on the environment specifically. There's a little bit on environmental integrity and about carbon sinks related to mitigation of emissions. So here it is. Here's the one of them about actively conserving sinks and reservoirs, which are our forests and our soils and our oceans as well. So these are some of the differences between if we hold to below 1.5 to hitting up towards 2 degrees Celsius. These are in red. You can quite clearly see the impacts. I'm just aware of my time. So from the CCC, which is the advisory board of the custodians of climate legislation in the Climate Change Act, has obviously evolved with the science, and when around the IPCC 1.5 report, there were 2 sort of global budgets, and one of them was about allowing a 50-50 chance of global warming to 1.5. So this is this is what I read that the CCC took, and then from there advised on the carbon budgets for future carbon budgets. So the thing with the carbon budgets in the UK and many countries is they allow for the use of negative emissions technologies, which are speculative, and many are in experimental stages. And Professor Kevin Anderson, who was one of our key contributors on the CEE Bill, has done lots of research on the fact that by factoring in these nets, nets, really we're not accounting for the emissions cuts we should be making as a wealthy country with a historical carbon debt. So in this paper, which you can, you're very welcome to have the slides after this, it was calculated that there was actually, we should be reducing our emissions by a factor of 2 if we didn't allow for the speculative nets that were prospective in the accounting.
Nessie, you've got 1 minute left.
Oh gosh. Right. So I will race through this. So there's
you can take some of my time. Take some of mine, Nessie.
Oh, bless you. Thanks. I really won't try. I try not to, Brian. I'll really be very quick. So really, there's lots of issues about nets, and there's lots of issues about how carbon accounting is done through production accounting, which is where we measure everything we produce in this country, and then we export. We account for those in our budget, but we don't do the reverse, which is account for embedded emissions in things we consume, which often come from other countries abroad and then are imported. So I have to say, all the signatories, I think Brian will correct me here, sign up to the production-based accounting system. So it's going all the same way. So in our bill, we're looking at consumption-based emissions accounting, which is actually, as we're net importers, our consumption emissions are up to about 46% or higher than through production emissions accounting. So it's a truer reflection of the UK's emissions and of many other minority world rich countries as well, because we're net importers. And actually the CCC have actually made this point recently about this, but of course it would mean also, to avoid double accounting, it would mean all other countries would have to agree to this way of accounting. Tell me if I have to stop, but I'm absolutely fine. So just quickly, I wanted to show that we often talk about the global impacts, but close to home, the climate impacts of going beyond 1.5 are very obvious, and the Met Office, for example, published a report. So has the many medics are very concerned about things like heat waves that cause higher pollution, so forth. So there's the other side to it as well, which is about biodiversity. The State of Nature report actually was recently published, and you can see here the figures about our biodiversity in the UK, which is pretty depleted. Recently, RSPB published a report, A Lost Decade for Nature, on the biodiversity targets that we have the UK's failed on. So I think that's quite 2/3 of targets, but they said there's been some regression as well on that. I can pass that one. Another point is really important to make about UK supply chains outsourcing. So it's not just the consumption emissions, but also the pollution and ecological footprint that comes in our supply chains. And there was a big report by the RSPB and along with the WWF about this, about our environmental footprint and the need to halve it by 2030, which is in 10 years' time.
I think you've made an excellent case for why we need the CEE bill. Just for the sake of time, should we go to Brian now? Because we are coming back to you, Nessie, at the end of the 40-minute session. And then
yes,
you can, just because we wanted to wrap up with the final bit about the CEE bill from you. So that's why we're going back to you for the last 10 minutes. So if we go over to Brian to do his bit now, to give us, so now that Nessie has set the scene, we'll go back in time to the Climate Change Act. And Brian, if you can set the scene historically, please.
Okay. Right.
Brian was most offended when I said that to him in the preparation meeting.
Anyway, thank you. I thank you for that, Nessie, and I'm incredibly supportive of most of the stuff behind what you're saying, the situation in climate change and in the ecological crisis we have as well. Now, can people see me? Because I can see West Berks can.
We can see you, but perhaps you're on speaker view rather than gallery view.
Fine, as long as you can see me, and I'll share my screen in a moment. But so I'm very supportive of that, and we clearly should be handling the climate crisis and the ecological crisis together as much as we can. Now, we do have a Climate Change Act that I'll talk about in a moment, and maybe we could have either, we could perhaps have a Biodiversity Act as well. But whatever happens, I hope that we don't undermine the Climate Change Act that we have. And that's what I want to talk about, because I think this is something where, I'm going to have to put my glasses on because I can't see it. Where's the screen gone? Oh yeah, there we are, okay. Yep, okay, that's it, with a bit of luck. And I can't see that bit too to make it full screen. Right, okay. Hopefully that's there now.
Yep, perfect.
Okay, right, so the Climate Change Act passed through the House of Commons in 2008, and it was an amazing act that was passed there. It was passed by, I think, 453 votes against 5, which is just fantastic to get Parliament thinking that something like this in such a unanimous manner. And it was world leading. It has a bit on adaptation, this blue bit here. But what I'll mainly talk about is the mitigation part. And there is a target there in the Act, 80% reduction by 2050. And I think Nessie mentioned some of that. I mean, I was actually involved in the calculation to produce that number, where we did start indeed with a chance of staying below 2 degrees or around 2 degrees. And we said, what does the world need to do? And then what is the UK's part in that? And very importantly, going bottom up, can we do it? And we decided, yes, it was possible. But knowing what politicians are like, a target in 2050 is one that most governments will ignore on the way till it gets to 2045. So another great part of the Act is that there are 5-year carbon budgets that are set up, and at present they're now set up to 2030 now. And those are legally binding once they've been accepted by Parliament. And the government of the day has the legal responsibility to put in place the policies to actually meet the current budgets and the future budgets as much as they should. So there is a strong legal requirement that Caton will, I expect, be talking about. And it also set up the Climate Change Committee to be a rather independent advisory board. And I was on that for 10 years, and it certainly is independent, I assure you. Now, that was an 80% reduction, and that was world leading at the time. No one else had an act like that, making them have such a target. But then we had the Paris Agreement, and it was clearly something new had to be done following that. And the Climate Change Committee was at last asked by the government what they should do, and provided the advice and said there should be net zero greenhouse gases rather than 80% reduction, net zero by 2050. By the way, that does include aviation and shipping as well. And the government accepted that. It was almost the last thing Theresa May did before she was ejected, or whatever the word is. And so the government accepted that. So that is now the target, the legal target, the adjustment of the Climate Change Act. Now I wanted to show this, and this is the final slide I'll show, which shows in black essentially the greenhouse gas emissions. And it doesn't really matter whether you take the black or the red curves. Now what you can see in the gray, you can see these have been falling. And in grey here, you have the targets that were proposed by the Climate Change Committee and accepted by government In fact, the government accepted one of the targets, yet not the final one. But you can see how we're doing, and this is Carbon Budget 4, which the Climate Change Committee have consistently told the government with increasingly strong language that the policies are not in place to hit the 4th carbon budget. And there's the 5th, and the 6th, as I'll come to in a moment, will be set soon. Now that was with an 80% reduction, but then with a 100% reduction, all these were set with 80% reduction in mind. But now we have 100% reduction. And the question is the UK government serious about meeting this zero target in 2050? If it is, then 6th carbon budget should be set somewhere around here. And the important thing that I'm concentrating on now is that the Climate Change Committee will recommend what they think this budget should be in December. And then we want huge pressure on the government to accept the sort of level that's being proposed. Otherwise, they're not serious about this zero by 2050 target. So we're not reaching there, and we want to reach something like this. Now, clearly, I don't think it's very good to agonize whether we should be zero in 2040, 2045, or 2050. We could spend all our time around here agonizing over which it is, and in the end, we'll miss them all. But if we really develop the technologies and ways of doing things, we can, when we reach this sort of stage, I'm sure, fine-tune, and we've developed things better. So if a more immediate target is needed, I think it will be possible at that stage. So I don't go in for this, oh, it should be 2045 rather than 2050 or whatever. That's just wasting time. Let's get on with doing it and achieving the very difficult targets we have. Now, this becomes even more important because the UK is leading COP26. It has a meeting in December to try and get the governments of the world to bring down their nationally determined contributions, which at the moment are probably consistent with a rather more than 3-degree world. But that means the UK is going to have to lead on this. And of course, we will be leading the COP in the year's time. But one of the things is that we're leaving the EU, and always before the EU have put in this nationally determined contribution, and we've been part of that. But now we're going to have to put in our own nationally determined contribution. And that's going to be for this sort of period round here. And unless it really is consistent with these sorts of levels and going down to zero somewhere around here, we will not be providing the leadership we need to do in the world. So what I'm very concerned is that we have the pressure on the UK government to accept a very strong 6th carbon budget for 2035, to set a very strong nationally determined contribution, which is really an example to the rest of the world, so that they see what we're doing and say, oh my goodness, we better do a bit better than we're doing. So whatever is done on the CEE Bill, I hope it will be done in a manner to increase the pressure on the government to do now what it has to do. That's the end of what I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian. Very well put. All right, so now we move to Ketan to tell us a bit about how the legislation is actually used in practice to help enforce some of these targets. So Ketan, over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to see so many people here. I will try to unify some of the things that Nessie and Brian were talking about and give you a flavor of whether and to what extent the CEE Bill can sort of serve two masters. That is to say, to not contradict what is in the Climate Change Act 2008, but also to strengthen it. And in doing so, I want to highlight some of what I see as a litigator in this area as some potential shortcomings of the Act. Now, I would like to say that I'm particularly well placed to talk about those shortcomings, which, by the way, have more to do with government implementation than legislative drafting or the wonderful scientific input advice formed the bedrock of the Act. But the reason I think I'm well placed to do that is because we had not one but two lawsuits at Plan B, a tiny NGO whose legal team I'm part of, to challenge government implementation of the Climate Change Act. The first was over the targets themselves based on the Paris Agreement, and the second had to do with the construction of Heathrow Airport, a third runway at Heathrow Airport, which we thought plainly contradicted the objectives of the Act and, of course, specific clauses. I won't use PowerPoints, but I will talk a little bit about legislative modification towards the end of my time. So fundamentally, what I want to put to you is that I think there's the capacity within the CEE bill for not diluting, but really concentrating the strength of climate change obligations and unifying them with biodiversity related ones. Now, I want to start that story at the Climate Change Act itself. As Brian so eloquently laid out for us, the magic of the Climate Change Act was to create 5 yearly targets, interim targets that would cover, that would make up for political short-termism, that would stop us from being a victim of changing governments and really a lack of concern for the long term. There's that old Thomas Jefferson quote, and you'll forgive my Americanism here, about how law is for the living. And obviously in the realm of climate change, we don't like to say that. In environmental law, we like to say that actually about most things, Thomas Jefferson was very wrong. That the law here should be for future generations as much as it is for the living. 5-year targets are a pretty great way to contradict that Jeffersonian edict. On the other hand, what we did see with the Act was that pressure on the government to make sure that they were going to achieve what was necessary with all of the downstream policy and industrial modifications that would require, didn't seem to result in immediate change. Another barrier we ran into was that, and I remember it very clearly now because it was exactly 4 years and a week ago today, it was October 13th, 2016, from the Committee on Climate Change, we got post-Paris advice. So this was after the Paris Agreement. What do we do with our climate change targets? Do we take that original figure Brian talked about, that 80% reduction by 2050, and do we make something more ambitious like the net zero target that we now have, or do we keep things the same? Now that report did criticize the government. This is October 13th, 2016. However, at the end of it, it told us, and we were in the middle of a lawsuit at this time, which is why I remember it so well, that despite all of these factors and despite what it, in a thinly veiled way called government intransigence, we shouldn't set new targets now. And that is not in any way to cast aspersions on the work of the Committee on Climate Change. It is to say that despite their independence, they were facing the same problem of a government not doing what it needed to do. And I don't think that is terribly disputed, that the battle is very much an uphill one, even if you are the independent and legislatively constituted committee. Now, we lost our challenge against the targets based on Paris. We'd essentially said, look, the targets are deficient because there's a section of the Climate Change Act which says the government should change targets. In fact, it says it can change targets if there are modifications to science or international law. We argued that both had happened. On the one hand, the Paris Agreement had been passed. And on the other hand, we were getting an increasingly granular picture of climate change's long-term effects and what sort of time horizon we were going to be looking at for those effects to transpire. All of these things and all of the sort of small reductions in uncertainty in the models meant that we probably needed to do something more ambitious. Of course, the Committee on Climate Change had long recognized this, and they took action on it in 2019. Suffice it to say, I won't go into the details, but we lost that suit primarily because the government retained a discretion to take action based on changes in international law and science. It was one that we essentially maintained shouldn't have been purely a discretion, but really an obligation to review and ideally change targets based on material changes in science and then international law. The short story of that lawsuit is we pressured the government. And in fact, we had what at the time were confidential meetings with the energy minister to discuss what the future of climate policy was going to look like. And, in a way, change was in the wind. The writing was a little bit on the wall. We knew that it was going to come, but it came a lot later. It came 3 years after that lawsuit. In fact, it came, as Brian showed us, on the very authoritative, incredibly powerful, and beneficial 2019 paper from the CCC. Now, then the sort of legal factual matrix we're presented with is one where the legislative tools are there, the framework is there, but getting the executive to do what we want to do what is right is a huge uphill battle still. And it's that launching pad. And you know, we litigated this, and of course, even in terms of Heathrow, we had to force the government to consider its own policy on climate change based on a section in an act which says the government must consider its own policy on climate change when pursuing large infrastructure projects. And they just didn't. They ignored their own white papers. They ignored their own implementation of the Paris Agreement, which wasn't about international law itself, but it was about inviting that international law. I'll recall, as Nessie pointed out, right, that most of the obligations within the Paris Agreement were not binding, but our government made them policy anyway, because that's what we expected them to do, despite whatever you make of the current executive. Now, given that even when clear language was used, we still had to force the government to, in this case, benchmark a third runway at an airport against its own policy, despite the fact that the language of benchmarking the runway against policy is in an act. I don't have a huge amount of faith in all but the clearest and most sort of aggressive legislation to keep the government in check. Now, I think that the CEE Bill serves to concentrate rather than dilute the obligations in relation to climate change in particular, because all it does is take, first of all, the model that Brian lauded, the 5-yearly targets or 5-yearly review, and says that instead we have annual review. Now, that's the first thing it does, and I don't think that's perfect. I think one issue is that annual review may even be too aggressive. We may not have year on year the information we really need to get an effective report. That is a potential flaw, absolutely. But it's probably better than 5-year targets because they can be a bit slow in terms of producing the right sort of set of actions that we're looking for. Now, so the first thing it does is it creates annual targets, which I think there are some flaws there, but generally this is a good thing. Now, the second thing it does is distill a set of targets around biodiversity. So it says, first of all, we shouldn't rely too much on negative emissions technology, particularly where that emissions technology is untested. For those of you who haven't looked at this issue or geoengineering, we're talking about things like spraying sulfate aerosols into the air to reduce emissivity that affects global warming. We're talking about the prospect of putting giant space mirrors up in space to do substantially the same thing. There are lots of hopefully amazing and eventually technologies that will be implemented, but that are as of yet untested. Now, the idea of the CEE bill in part is to say, look, we should test those things before we view them in the same light as degrowth related strategies, or as strategies which tend to reduce consumption, which reduce the creation of domestic emissions, and which ensure that we don't outsource domestic emissions abroad, which is, of course, something that is wont to happen in any kind of capitalist political economy. Whatever you make of that capitalism, the issue is that if we say we can't have the emissions here, we can outsource them elsewhere. Now, at the point of implementation, the Climate Change Act left some loopholes for this sort of thing to happen. Not huge loopholes, but still ones that at this point, I think democratically we agree we should address.
Hayden, you've got 1 minute left.
Sure, thank you. Now, given that, I think ultimately those two main changes, so first of all, that we pair targets together and we make more aggressive what the Climate Change Act sets out to do. I see that the only case for dilution is a recourse to a general political principle, which is that when you have two pieces of legislation that essentially distill the same imperative or the same type of obligation, you may confuse rather than clarify the law and what the obligations of politicians are. I think that general case is actually true. And I think that is one of the main strengths of Brian's argument. Now, I think in this specific case, based on the statutory language we have, that there is an exception. That in this case, having yearly review and having a biodiversity target that by nature of its language doesn't, and I would submit, I wouldn't say cannot, because I'm simply not that confident in any aspect of a statute, but doesn't tend to dilute the climate change argument, the climate change targets. We've got a biodiversity target that will sort of stand on its own within the context of this bill, but it has been crafted at this point so that it won't interfere with the wonderful amended Climate Change Act 2008. I will leave the rest of my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so Nessie, we head back to you just to wrap it up on the CEE bill before we open the floor for questions.
Thanks ever so much. I'm not going to use my slides because I feel more nervous using slides than just speaking, and also I'm more aware of time if I just speak really rapidly. So hopefully most of the audience may have had the chance to have a look at the executive summary, which is a shortened version of the bill. And one of the things we have to say is that the bill at the moment is really a framework and a set of principles, without doubt. It has a clear objective, which is for the UK's contribution to holding to a fair contribution to holding to under 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then it has a strategy that has a set of stipulations of criteria, and they include, and what they do is we would love it to link in with the Climate Change Act. And we're very aware that this is the first iteration and that it is most likely to fall. We know it looks more like an advocacy tool at the moment. We're very realistic about that. But what we really want is when the next parliamentary session begins, we want to bring on board people like Ketan and Brian, and with these amazing expertise who can somehow, if the CEE bill, if it becomes a set of amendments to the Climate Change Act, it doesn't really matter. It's certainly not a vanity project. All we want is to have commensurate emergency measures that reflect and align to the science and this crisis we're in. This is a critical juncture. I read only recently that the Met Office quoted something about it's probably maybe less than 5 years it will breach the 1.5 Celsius global temperature. We will definitely overshoot. And around biodiversity, there's been a desperate call to have a similar type of ecological act that is similar and as robust as the Climate Change Act as well, and that we just have 10 years to slow down the ecological breakdown. So in our bill, it talks about it has two sides to the coin. You have the biodiversity part, and it's all about conservation and enhancement of biodiversity, including both human-induced ecosystems, that's agroecology, and also natural ecosystems. Then it also has a part on capitalizing, I should say, more actively managing our carbon sinks. So this is what nature gives us, these wonderful natural carbon sinks, but they have to be actively managed, otherwise they can become net emitters and rather than absorbing atmospheric carbon dioxide. We also then have another stipulation that in terms of the use of nets, they are not to be accounted for in the energy sector or the energy systems, because we have an incredible infrastructure already of renewable energy, and we can reduce down to net zero in the energy system. However, in agriculture, cement and steel sectors, I know greenhouse gases can't be completely eliminated. However, the use of nets within the stipulation of the bill is specific that unless there's absolute safeguarding that there are no critical impacts on our ecosystems, on food production and water and other ecological, socially related systems, then they must not be utilized, they must not be deployed. So there's a circumscribed use of nets. The other thing is around, of course, the consumption emissions accounting. Now, this would be an amazing thing for the UK government as co-host at COP26 to bring on the platform as world leaders to actually inspire particularly minority world countries to change from production-based emissions accounting to consumption-based emissions accounting. If you did that, then obviously you'd encourage net producers who are mainly in developing countries or emerging economies, they too will have great incentive to produce goods with lower embedded emissions. And again, it is about the UK also providing financial assistance of flows to those countries that are developing and need more help with their infrastructure, because we carry a huge historical carbon debt. And then the supply chains is about, again, outsourcing our pollution. And there was a great big WWF report on this, and that said our ecological footprint is enormous and not relative to our population size per capita. So that would mean that within legislation, we would have to be responsible for any kind of ecological degradation along our supply chains, be it for fashion, be it for food, be it for timber, paper production, palm oil, and so forth. And finally, very important, just to say that this bill at the moment is non-prescriptive. It just talks about we have to meet these objectives somehow related to the current carbon budgets that are in the Climate Change Act, and that Parliament and government would act in collaboration with an emergency citizens' assembly. And that's a sort of tripartite mechanism of creating the recommendations which would empower MPs to make the kind of radical structural changes that are required in this kind of radical legislation, potentially. But most of all, we want to build on the Climate Change Act, and absolutely, they're not mutually exclusive. They absolutely should work together, and we absolutely have to get behind the Climate Change Act for the 6th carbon budget in December and lobby our MPs equally, absolutely. Sorry, I've gone way over time, sorry.
But it's great to hear the enthusiasm, and it's not that much more over time, so don't worry.
Better than my slides.
All right, so I think that has set the scene very nicely. So as I said at the beginning, we have got pre-submitted questions that we will go through, but please feel free to submit questions on the chat as well, and we will try to weave those into the pre-submitted questions as possible. If you don't hear the exact text of your pre-submitted question, hopefully it's just because we've amalgamated it into another one. But if not, then please feel free to ask again on the chat. And I would say that if you want to ask your question specifically on the chat, then please put your hand up to do so, and I will come to you. All right, and you know how to put your hand up like virtually on the Zoom thing. You can, it's an option in your profile. Please put on the chat if you don't know how to do it, and I'll explain on the chat. All right, so we'll go to the first pre-submitted question. So this is from Claire Wilshire from XR Newbury. She says that my MP tells me we don't need the CEE bill because the Environment Bill goes far enough. How does the CEE bill differ from the Environment Bill, and do you think she's right? So first we'll go to Nessie on this one.
So I have quite a few comments and I can rush through them. And these are from a lawyer actually who's been scrutinising, so I can't take the credit, scrutinising the Environment Bill. And so first of all, the Environment Bill isn't tied to climate commitments at all. It's a standalone and there's no cross-reference at all to the Climate Change Act. The Environment Bill timescales are very long. The Secretary of State has to come up with targets around 4 categories: air quality, water, biodiversity, and resources for waste production, that's recycling. And the draft doesn't have to be produced till October 2022. So that's a long delay. And the Secretary of State has an obligation to produce an environmental improvement plan But the draft does not have to, again, is not required to be, this plan is not required until January 2023. So there's very long time frame there. Also, this, within the SOS's environmental improvement plan, they talk about significantly improve the natural environment. Well, that's very open to interpretation. What does that mean, significantly improve? And in the meantime, between now and we're coming to Brexit, we're coming out of the EU regulations, which leaves us very open. So apparently, in the meantime, the 2018 Green Future, which is a 25-year plan to improve the environment, there's nothing legally binding in holding the government to account there. In terms of the targets of the Environment Bill, it has only to produce one target in each of the 4 areas, but it's not specified to what scope or degree these targets need to be. So they could be significant, whatever that means, but there's no real kind of hard sort of benchmark figures there. The environment targets go across a span of 15 years, reviewed every 5 years, similar to the Climate Change Act, but no interim targets at all. So again, there's no legal accountability during the interim time. The environment, the government is not required. Also, there's nothing about regression on the standards of we are under the EU regs. So there's nothing in the bill at the moment that ensures that we don't regress on our present standards as we are under the EU. And then there's, of course, that the government, again, there's the risk of that when we come out of the EU. I mean, we already have seen that with the withdrawal agreement around trade and the border with Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that there's been some backtracking with the withdrawal agreement. So again, we have to question a matter of trust. And as the UK is will be no longer under the sort of regs of the EU courts, the government is setting up an office for environmental protection, but under the wording of this in the bill, there's concern around issues of independence, funding, whether it's adequate, and whether it has limited law enforcement. So lawyers who've been scrutinizing this said you could drive, I've put many coach and horses through the bill at present. So now I was meant to say, what about the CEE Bill? Well, the CEE Bill has a very tight time frame, and of course it's got to be set up. The strategy, everything has to be in the draft of the strategy, has to be done within the year, and implementation started after the act is passed within the year or just after the year. And of course we haven't set targets, so that's what we're missing, and that's what we're going to have in our next iteration when we draw in what even more wonderful experts, Ketan and Brian. I'm looking at you both. But this is what we need. We need benchmark standards. We also would love to see the scope of the CCC increase to incorporate the ecological targets, because they do an amazing job. And Brian, you're absolutely right. They're an independent body, and they really do try to hold the government to account. So yes, I think that's enough of the Environment Bill.
Thank you very much. I'll just turn to Brian and Ketan to say what you think as to whether we need the CEE Bill because the Environment Bill goes far enough. So I'll turn to Brian first, please.
Yeah. The Environment Bill is far too weak. I totally agree. It's learnt nothing from how the best parts of the Climate Change Act and the regression from being in the EU really worries me. And there's no teeth in it at all, so we need something else.
Okay, thanks. And Keaton?
Sure. So Nessie has provided a great backdrop, so I'll just go into a few particular areas. So in principle, one of the things the Environment Bill does, as Nessie mentioned, is to set up an Office for Environmental Policy. In principle, that office is supposed to replicate many of the functions of the European Commission, particularly their Environment Directorate. Now, that means that for certain breaches of environmental law, in principle, the OEP, the Office for Environmental Policy, is supposed to be able to take the equivalent of infraction actions, so an enforcement action in domestic courts. Now, as Brian pointed out, that this lack of bite, right, comes from the fact that essentially what the OEP can do in the first instance when it finds a violation is issue a decision notice, which is a non-binding recommendation, and it doesn't have any power to compel a response or to sanction based on failure to comply with the decision notice. What it can do is essentially sue or, go for a judicial review in the normal way based on the original conduct. So not based on the idea that we're the regulator, you've done something wrong, fix it in the next 60 days, but rather we think you've done something wrong and a court is now going to verify whether our opinion is correct. The difference is night and day, really. So yeah, they don't really have the bite they need in terms of enforcement powers, and that's a huge concern. And of course, substantially every statutory consultee that has been called to Parliament has mentioned this so far. Briefly, the other thing I'd like to mention is maybe one of the good bits, not because I'm supportive of the bill in its current form, but it is good to cover some of the all right stuff it does and maybe weaknesses therein. So very briefly, it does create an obligation for all planning permission that is granted across the country to involve net biodiversity gain. So the threshold it sets is 10%, and some of you may be thinking, how in the world are you measuring biodiversity gain? Therein lies the problem, that the metrics are essentially contested, but beyond that, we have what is basically a good obligation to begin with, that every piece of planning permission must come with net biodiversity gain to the tune of 10%. Now, the difficulty here is one of the main ways that developers can get around this, or not necessarily get around it, but achieve the 10%, is to buy biodiversity credits. So this is a form of offsetting, if any of you have heard of that practice. It is a maybe less severe form of looking at restoring habitats in Southeast Asia in exchange for domestic pollution. We're keeping it domestic for the purposes of the Environment Bill, but the principle is not so different. The sort of salient critique here is we, in a way, call this the tradable destruction of nature, because that's part of what it can do unless your targets are so tight, and your metrics, rather, are so tight that you can verify in each and every situation based on some sort of shared standard that your offset is going to work, that the credit for a perhaps, unfulfilled at the time of issuance credit, that is going to be sufficient to actually restore a habitat. That is a deeply speculative game. And that's the main issue with this biodiversity condition, which again, at its baseline is good. The issue is always going to be implementation. The secondary issue is enforcement powers that the Office for Environmental Policy will have. Right now, it is not super strong. And, we've seen what Theresa May's government did, right? They appointed Phil Juniper to be the head of Natural England, sort of so they could keep him in their sights. Phil Juniper from Friends of the Earth, I mean. And the difficulty was it didn't let them do much. Anyway, I'll stop there.
It feeds very nicely into our next question, which is a combined question, which is, does the CEE bill ensure that the government actually have to deliver what they commit to? And if not, then is there anything we can do to hold government accountable? So I'll go to Nessie first again on this one, please.
So is this at the moment, presently, the CEE Bill, all it does is require the government, if it were passed, it would require the government, duty of the Prime Minister, to meet the objective, which is around the Paris Agreement temperature, and build a strategy about mitigation, and also ecological restoration, including our carbon sinks. And so they're not, and what happens is it would also require the CCC, which would be either enlarged in scope or consult with other specialist independent bodies around the ecology to build in the metrics. So we haven't specified any metrics there. All those would have to be built in. And also, so really what the bill does, you have the objectives, and then you have the criterion around which this draft strategy must abide by in order to meet the objectives. And then within the draft strategy, you will have those recommendations tied to targets. And once that's, so then what will happen is those targets will then have to be legally binding. So as I said, this is the first iteration of the bill. So we're already starting on the second. We've been speaking to Client Earth and actually another lawyer, Plan B, and we're building up our expertise so that the second iteration will build in the legislative teeth. That it at the moment is a bill of principle rather than actual hard, fast targets. That Ketan will definitely agree with me there, that there's a lot of work to be done and it's evolving, but we've come this far on a group of volunteers in about 9 months, so that now we have our setting. We just need the second chapter is about the legislative sort of stringency that we need to implement.
I see. And a following question just to Ketan and Brian. Do you think that would be sufficient to hold the government to account?
I'll let Kevin go first on this.
So I think here's the main barrier, right? It's getting a bill through Parliament that sets out parameters for judicial review that doesn't allow them a sort of get out of jail free card. That's the big challenge. Now, if we got a bill through Parliament that didn't restrict judicial review, that would be a great place to start. I think in terms of the scrutiny, right now in this part of the bill, it doesn't change massively. Sorry, really, it doesn't change at all the situation with respect to judicial review that's in the Climate Change Act 2008. It replaces, as one of the sort of grounds for review, changes in international law or international law as a monolith with specific reference to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement as a subsidiary instrument under that framework convention. The legal effect is the same, whether you name Paris and name the UNFCCC or don't. They are both international law and are so caught under the ambit of the original act. So I think the way it would be enough is if it goes through Parliament and there are amendments, we make sure that judicial review isn't constrained artificially. And we make sure that the relevant time periods are present, that we're not looking at a really restrained, even 6-week time period, that we have the full 3 months for a JR. That would be plenty, to be honest, that we have those tools there unencumbered. So really to let the law let judicial accountability do what it has always been constitutionally, even if in an unwritten way, meant to do. That's a huge part of enforcement, I think. Obviously, it'd be great if we could get out the other end and have something more ambitious that we have in other statutes, but I don't think it's worth going into that because it's perhaps a little bit too optimistic.
All right, thanks. And Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, yeah, on the Climate Change Committee, we were always aware that in the final analysis, the government could only be had up for judicial review if they didn't follow what was being said and also follow the targets. But I think personally, I was very happy to see this being challenged in the court by Plan B, etc. So that's personally that made me happy to see. But in the end, we rely on MPs and on the general public to have enough swell of support to show that government can't go against it. And we've seen what happens. Government can sign a treaty, international treaty, 1 year and then not follow it. So, so they can ignore anything if there is not enough swell of support in the Houses of Parliament and in the public to say you cannot do this.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to ask one more pre-submitted question before going to the questions coming in on the chat. There's a lot of good questions coming in on the chat, but I just want to cover this point first. And it's something that Nessie has picked up on in her explanations, and I just want to probe it a little bit more. So this is the fact that our understanding is that the CEE bill will not even be debated in Parliament. So Nessie, you were saying that it's being viewed of at the moment as, I forget what the term you used was, but like a tool for further debate on the subject, right? And then you said that it would be, the ideal aim is that it would be introduced into Parliament in the next session of Parliament as a bill in its own right, introduced by hopefully a member of the government, I guess. And so can you just explain why it will not be debated in Parliament in this session, please? And say a little bit about what will happen next with it.
Well, it has been signed as an early day motion, I believe, by, I'm not sure if it's between 65 or 70 MPs. Obviously, that's a relative number, but it's not the forceful over 400 that you got with the Climate Change Bill Act that became the Act. So what will happen is, when it was first tabled on the 2nd of September, its second reading is in March, probably. But yes, absolutely right. There's an order of bills that can be then debated again, and if your bill is right at the bottom, there's just, the time runs out, so your bill doesn't see the light of day in terms of a debate. And of course, the parliamentary session, which is the parliamentary year, is probably due to finish in springtime anyway. And if that second reading is in March, then the bill will naturally fall. But what we have to, even with the with the big ask originally, it did fall actually, and then you had an early day motion that was then supported by hundreds of MPs when it rose again, if you like. So it doesn't really matter. Don't worry about the parliamentary procedures or process. That's just something to put off people. What we need is critical mass of people lobbying, and the same with the Climate Change Act when we come to the 6th carbon budget, lobbying their MPs, writing in. It's all about numbers. It's not about engaging in some kind of rebuttal and argument to try and win your case, particularly if you're in a constituency where the MPs are not particularly interested. It's about critical mass and getting as many constituents writing into their MPs, because as soon as an MP feels that pressure, because they also want to be elected the next time, then they will then start to think, oh, actually, an awful lot of my constituents feel this is the most important matter to them. And that's what is important. So we just can't just to say, oh, well, it probably will fall in the spring, but it will rise again like a phoenix, because we're going to have this more robust version or iteration. And then we just have to push through. The Climate Change Act, I think it took, was it 3 years to become an act? And at the beginning, it was a small bill, a private member's bill. So it's not a reason to suddenly say, oh, no, let's not bother. We just have to give up. We're at a really critical time. We're during an unprecedented time in history, a pandemic. We have this critical period for the climate and ecological planetary health. We really just can't afford to worry about parliamentary procedures that cause filibustering and so forth.
Thank you very much. That's a great explanation. All right, so we'll go to the first question from the chat. So this is a question from Ed Cooper. If you'd like to ask your question yourself, you're welcome to unmute yourself and start your video. Now I've put you on the spot.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just get my chat back up to find my question, because I've asked another one since. Okay, yes, one of the big issues here is clearly measuring biodiversity. One of my big fears is that the sector, the conservation sector, is inherently and systemically very slow. And we could spend 3 years, maybe even 5 years, agreeing what we're going to try and measure before getting on with any practical work. And yet we're meant to be in an emergency. And I just wonder what the panel think is the answer to that. Or do they agree or disagree on that?
So I'm going to...
And perhaps we should just be getting on with things in a common sense way on the ground and be acting fast now. And maybe targets will follow. But there's a real danger that targets slow everything down.
So I'll ask Caton to answer that question first, because he's already started answering it a little bit in the chat.
Sure. So Ed, I think your concern is totally legitimate and ultimately borne out. If we spend too much time debating measurement, we run the risk of a parallel to what was one scientific debate in the late 90s, for example, about, oh, if our climate modeling systems are essentially based on, among other things, fluid dynamics modeling that is 100 years old, how are we ever going to get the level of resolution we need to do something about this? And, we can't risk repeating that here. And, you look at that, maybe Brian can weigh in, but my understanding of that issue is, according to people like Professor Tim Palmer, our models are just changed a little bit as the years go on, and fundamentally they're not still so structurally different from those fluid dynamics representations and things like the heat equation and all of that. They're not, super sophisticated stochastic models a lot of the time. And I think with biodiversity, we're at, we certainly don't have the, for example, the post-PhD mathematical talent to put into these measurement systems for biodiversity. There's, the EU, our government has identified real skill gaps there in terms of creating tight systems for measurement that will, allow us to access the sort of macro outputs we're looking at. So on the one hand, yes, we can't not take action on the ground that we don't have a good measurement system. As you say, I think we need to start. However, I think rolling out progressively a good measurement system for biodiversity is going to be crucial. And as I mentioned, one of the biggest obstacles here is just going to be when developers are allowed to use offsets and the measurement and verification with respect to those offsets. That, one easy rule would be they must not be too future-facing and speculative. If you're going to use an offset, we need demonstrable evidence, not something that's sort of a pie in the sky.
All right, thank you. And Brian, what's your take on the ratio between working out what targets we should have versus practical action on the ground?
Well, I suppose I said in my talk that we shouldn't spend all the time arguing about whether it's 2045 or 2050. We should get on with it. And I feel the same is true with the biodiversity. But I think it's with climate, at least there is one number that sort of tends to summarize everything, which is global temperature, global surface temperature. And you can argue, well, whatever we do, we should try and work on that, and perhaps the others will follow, give or take. And you won't have the same in biodiversity, and different, it even comes into human values of what you value in an ecosystem, and this will going to be extremely difficult. And do we actually understand the ecosystems well enough to understand what are the crucial ingredients in that? So I think it is a major problem, but I think we all understand that we're trashing the ecosystems at the moment. So we really need to do something, get on with it, and then perhaps we can find the metrics afterwards. I sort of agree with that.
Nessie, do you want to add anything further, just quickly for the sake of time?
I suppose it was just that any benchmark standards must begin with no further regression, that's for certain. So we have to hold it to the point we're at. But some of our ecologists were speaking about things like soil quality is a very direct one that can be it's very a very physical and tangible way to look at quality of the fertility of the soil, which of course relates to agroecology as well. Look at the impact of monocultures when you have afforestation. And I think they look at quantity as well as quality of biodiverse habitats, but it's much harder to pin down. But the ACHI target should be employed immediately, not just kicked in the long grass.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about the CEE Bill, right? That it has very immediate targets in it. Sorry, go on, Brian.
Yes, one of the things about climate is we sort of agree we should try and get back to as close as possible to pre-industrial. But of course, with nature, Are we looking at what point in human evolution with nature are we wanting to go back to? We want to go back to the time before we were really impacting at all. I'm not sure that's what is a realistic target. Somehow we're looking for a nature which is much more vivid than it is at the moment, and some sort of equilibrium between our species and the rest of nature. But it couldn't be the existence nature before we were around. That would be impossible. So the question we want to get is a problem.
All right, so we've got 3 more questions that I would like the panel to answer before we run out of time. Just one more from the floor. So this is from Sandy. Would you like to unmute yourself and turn your video on if you'd like to ask your question yourself? You can just unmute yourself if you don't want to put your video on.
No, that's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, lovely. Okay, I just wondered what the panelists, whether the panelists believe the government has the stomach for attending to all the different climate change issues and what needs to be done, what with COVID and Brexit looming so large.
So who should go to first on that one? Brian.
I'm so pleased we've got COP26, because that really focuses their mind. Without that, I can imagine they would wander backwards, whatever. But we have a time scale here. The rest of the world is going to be looking to us for leadership. And this government and the UK are going to have tremendous egg on our faces if we don't measure up to that. And of course, the disaster in terms of the world, in terms of the climate as well. So the pressure of this COP26 and all that's involved in that is my big hope that that pressure means they can't just say, oh, well, we'll put it off to the subsequent years and whatever. They've got to handle it now. And they've had trouble handling 2 crises at once, COVID and Brexit. Well, they've got to handle a third, which is the climate change, and doing something about that. And they know the rest of the world's watching them, having not had a very good impression on the other 2. Can they do better on the third?
All right, thank you very much. And over to you, Nessie, what's your response?
I think that coronavirus is very much a symptom, a zoonotic disease, a symptom of ecological breakdown anyway. It's sort of in our faces, literally. It's had dire consequences for the poorest countries, but also in the UK, people have suffered terribly. It's an opportunity, in other words, not the condition, it's terrible, but it's a time where, as we're exiting, by the looks of things, on a hard Brexit, of a green recovery, there's a lot of infrastructure and investment. We've been speaking to, we certainly had some associations with Kate Rayworth, who had come up with this amazing donut economy and about sustainability and circular economies. There are lots of, this is a window, and if we don't capture this window, we will be going through, to a point where adaptation, we're not prepared for adaptation either. So this is absolutely a critical point where I think if they don't turn to a green economy, I don't know if there'll be some kind of rebellion, because already
there already is with Extinction Rebellion, right?
Oh,
all right, and
the bill is independent of XR.
and Caton, over to you. You're muted.
I don't want to say too much about this issue. I think we've had 2 great responses so far. Yeah, I think ultimately I'd like to pick up on Nessie's last point and one of Brian's first points. So in that order, yeah, I think ultimately the risk of not taking action is, as Nessie said, that we get a really prominent civil society and democratic kind of rebellion, even more so than we already have. On Brian's first point, I think it's a really important one in terms of, looking at Aichi and sorry, not looking at Aichi, but looking at biodiversity and what we're actually trying to get back to, or, what sort of state we're trying to get biodiversity in. I think this is something that's often missed, is that we're not going back to these, Victorian understandings of what nature looks like. We mustn't do that. We have to sort of prepare for a relatively new horizon of what improved biodiversity looks like, a new vividness of nature, to pick up on on Brian's point. I'll leave it there.
All right, thank you very much. So we've got two more topics to cover. One is the Citizens Assembly, and the second is what can we as individuals do to help push the government on this issue. So we've got a few questions on Citizens Assembly. I'm going to try and roll them all up a little bit. So there's a concern from someone who says that they think their MP will view the Citizens Assembly as undemocratic. And there's a question on the pre-submitted one wanting to know more about how the CEE Bill proposes using Citizens Assembly. So is it a long-term role or repeatedly using new randomly selected people? And then there's a third part of the question, which is, can the law help to ensure that the decisions of the Citizens Assemblies are legally binding? So we'll go to Nessie first to say about how the CEE Bill intends to use the idea of Citizens Assembly and what her response is about the MP thinking that it's undemocratic.
Okay, well, we currently do have a type of democracy. It's called a representative democracy. So we may question how democratic that is in itself, that we have one representative, and then if they gain one more vote, they become representative of a whole constituency. So maybe just to let's think what how we define democracy anyway. Within the bill itself, it is an emergency citizens assembly that will be there will be a tender put out by government to actually for a reputable independent specialist body to set up the CA, to do random stratification. So we have a cross section of society, but they won't have free reign, the Citizens Assembly. They will go through the process of learning with experts and facilitated deliberation, and will then set about informing the government or collaborating with the government and Parliament in writing a draft for the strategy. The strategy will meet the objectives. So, and at every point there has to be parliamentary scrutiny. In fact, this was something that the Caroline Lucas MP, who tabled our bill, was absolutely it's very strict on that we had parliamentary scrutiny throughout the process of the strategy. So it's not giving them free rein. It also means that when you've had a Citizens Assembly, the Citizens Assembly is there to empower the MPs in making these quite radical policies, actually. But of course, because if the bill were to become an act, all of it, including the Citizens Assembly's recommendations, would be then legally binding, because the Citizens Assembly work they're embedded in part of this strategy of producing a strategy that will be scrutinised by Parliament and then enacted as a set of policies.
Okay, thank you. And Ketan, can you just add a bit on how the law can help ensure the decisions of the Citizens' Assemblies are legally binding?
Sure. So I think there's a fine balance to strike, right, between respecting, our constitutional arrangements in terms of parliamentary sovereignty on the one hand, and on the other hand, making sure that the Citizens' Assembly is not made inert. I think, as Nessie said, one way you can do this is say, sure, we're not going to have Citizens' Assemblies replace lawmakers. That is a radical idea in not necessarily the way we want. On the other hand, you can have almost like a CCC style approach. And I don't mean that the Citizens Assembly becomes scientific experts, but I mean that review of what they find, what they decide, should be a binding, not a check, but a binding procedure, right? So Parliament must engage with the body of evidence they did and the decision they came to. And part of this movement comes really from a lot of academic work in science and technology studies, in cultural geography, which looks at the ways in which science can be mobilized. And, you know, every climate and biodiversity issue is going to have an element of scientific inputs and outputs. The way these things are mobilized by the communities who are affected by them, right? So, you know, it's not a totally legal point, but a classic example of this is you look at flood risk mitigation and adaptation strategies in somewhere like Yorkshire. A lot of really interesting research was done on the ability of the local communities there to find local solutions to drainage issues. And in fact, you know, I mean, there's a great article by Sarah Watmore called Earthly Powers, where she looks at how these drainage issues are dealt with better by local people than DEFRA. Now, that's an isolated example, but part of what the Citizens Assembly for Climate channels is this idea that affected people can come to reasonable decisions, can look at evidence, and we can then say that, sure, Parliament looks at it afterwards. But as long as they engage, then we'll have something a little bit more effective, hopefully, than what we have now. So it's a fine balance, but, you know, keeping Parliament involved is crucial, is what I would say.
All right, thanks. And Brian, just a quick word from you on your views on citizen assemblies.
I've seen the climate change Citizens Assembly work. It worked well in Ireland when there was a log jam on abortion, and that solved the whole thing. We had one in climate change this year, and I don't think it's really changed much that's gone on. So I remain to be convinced that this will work, but I'm going to look to see what you're saying about it, because you've obviously thought about it a lot more than I have. But it's something that sits for too long wouldn't work, I don't think, because they're no longer ordinary citizens. So somehow you're getting continual new sets of people at various stages of this and interacting. They have to become an expert enough, but then not too expert, because that would not be the point of it. So I'll be interested to see what you try and put together on that.
All right, thank you. I'm sorry, Nessie, I am not going to let you reply to that. Just for the interest of time, we've got one very important question remaining to ask. I'm afraid we've not had time to ask all of the questions that have come in on the chat, but we've tried to represent all of them through the questions we have asked. But there's one very important question left to ask, which is that hopefully this discussion will have helped the people attending to shape their thoughts on what action they feel the government should be taking. So I'd like to ask each of you to say a little bit about what would you advise on how we can each use our democratic power to help influence the government action that we want to see. So I'll go to Nessie on this one first. So what would you advise that we as individuals do to, you know, lobby our MPs and so on to see the action we want on climate change?
So hopefully this will have informed you, but please do go to our website, have a look at the bill, the executive summary, and then, you know, reflect on also how it completely interlinks with the Climate Change Act. Then write a personal letter, it's most powerful, or an email to your MP in your constituency. And it is really, as I say, don't engage in rebuttals, just write and then write again, and then ask your friends and your neighbours and your family to write, because it's all about numbers and it's all about critical mass. And this will continue from now right until towards COP26. This is the most crucial platform, as Brian said, for the UK government, for the UK, and the UK can have a massively inspirational role on the global platform. And we just have this one chance. So that's simply that.
Is there one thing that you think we should be asking for when we write to our MPs?
Brian, I hope you don't mind to support the CEE Bill.
We can come to Brian and what he thinks.
also now to absolutely support the backing and the honouring of the carbon budgets in the Climate Change Act. You can definitely do both. They are not contradictory at all.
All right, thank you very much. And over to you, Brian.
Yes, well, I ask everyone to keep their eyes on what's happening. So you have to go below the COVID and the Brexit and find out what's happening in this climate change situation. which hasn't been much in the headlines apart from when there's weather disasters around. And the crucial time is coming up. As I say, this sixth carbon budget is going to be recommended, I think, in December by the Climate Change Committee. That's going to be an incredibly important time to put pressure on your MP, discuss it in your community, whatever, write to the newspaper that this must be taken because, as Nessie would say, it's the absolute minimum that we need to do. I think that's the lesson of what you've said. And we have to put the pressure on that this is what must be taken on board, and that the UK contribution to, as its nationally determined contribution, has to be something to make the world sit up and say, my goodness, can we actually compete with this? Because this should be something where the countries of the world are competing to see how they can be at the top of the pile, i.e. the lowest, because those are the countries that will actually have the industries that will succeed.
All right, thanks. And last but not least, over to Keaton.
Sure. So, I mean, I echo what has been said before me. In addition to that, yeah, I would definitely echo the point about supporting something like the CEE bill. I would also urge in relation to the sixth carbon budget, but on top of that, in relation to the environment bill, there's a lot of strength in urging amendments in the same way that there is for advocating a bill like CEE. I think all of those things are really crucial in terms of this no rebuttal point of critical mass. So first of all, the critical mass is important. Ultimately, the time you spend maybe arguing with an MP, if you get the opportunity to, maybe better spent getting more emails in. Now, I would like to emphasize, though, that if that dialogue does happen, you know, certainly, however beholden MPs are to constituencies, they are also human and are amenable to argument, at least to a certain degree. I mean, I think the real point on these sorts of progressive ambitions is to say, why are these things radical? I saw in the chat people were talking about MPs talking, you know, mentioning that the bill is unrealistic. It just isn't that different than the Climate Change Act. That's part of its strength. How can it be so radical when the changes are important but relatively modest? If we made a Climate Change Act, why don't we have one? Why aren't those obligations extant for biodiversity? Why are we relying on speculative commitments under the Environment Bill? So I think the action to take is, yes, to first of all get critical mass. Second of all, when the opportunity arises and you've developed the arguments, and I don't think they have to be all that specifically legal or couched in that language, I think there are general principles at play here. I think it's to also engage that strategically. And finally, as Brian said, I think it's to, with the combination of those things, create this sort of marketplace for, you know, competing on who can do this the best, a transition from the UK's thought leadership into leadership on environmental action.
All right, well, thank you very much. We're going to finish up here. Firstly, I would like to thank our panelists and speakers, Brian, Nessie and Keaton. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. You know, you guys have spent a long time understanding all of the ins and outs, and it's very useful for us as you know, people who don't have enough time to understand everything. It's very useful to have that insights from you guys. To the audience, I would say that we will be posting the recording in the Facebook event afterwards, and we will post the links to the CEE Bill website. There's also an email address that is part of the CEE Bill Alliance, so we'll post that as well, so you can ask any further questions you would like to do so on that. And with that, I will say good night. Thank you ever so much for all your questions and for your attention throughout the session. Thank you very much and good night.